My man, Chris. So Chris Hussey, Chris Nelson.
Chris and Chris, baby.
Chris and Chris. All right. So basically, we're putting this together to kind of educate people on insurance, which is what you specialize in. So why don't you tell me a little bit about who you are and what you do?
So again, my name's Chris Hussey. I'm an independent insurance agent. So I started as a captive agent with Allstate about 8 years ago or so, and then broke off into the independent world. The difference there is, as an independent agent, I have access to a bunch of different companies, so I'm not nailed down to one company. Like
Give variety. Give your clients some more options, if you will.
I can shop it around for new clients as well as current clients. So in the insurance industry right now, there's a lot of fluctuation with pricing. It's constantly changing for a variety of different reasons, but especially for my current clients, one company takes a big price increase, I can shop it around. So that's the big benefit of being an independent agent.
Awesome.
So I've had my agency here for about 5 years, a little over 5 years now.
And when you say here, where are you actually located?
I'm in Conshohocken, right on Fayette Street, corner of 7th and Fayette.
Good old country. Good old country. All right. So with that being said, Chris, really the reason I wanted to reach out to you and put this together is because, literally just this week, we've seen some things right in our very own backyard that we don't see too often. And to kind of just jump right into it, we had this significant rain, and unfortunately, a lot of people were caught in a situation where their houses were destroyed or impacted by this. And that's really what I wanted to talk to you about. Is I think there's a misconception when people feel as though they have homeowners insurance. They really feel as though that they're protected from anything and everything. So
anything. Yep.
Why don't you, if you were to educate me a little bit on what a general policy is, what that covers, and maybe what it doesn't cover that people need to consider.
Sure. So the big point there is, going off of the topic of these recent storms, is the flood. Flooding is one thing that some people may feel it's something you're covered for, major flood, water damage.
Mm-hmm.
Not something that's ever going to be covered on a homeowner's policy. Flood is always separate. It's a separate policy that most people don't have unless you're in a flood zone,
right.
Meaning, it's a federal government program that sets these flood zones. And if you're in one, you have to have the insurance. But if you're not in it, you don't have to have it. And most people don't have it. And that's just off this topic of these storms that we just saw. That's one thing that you are never covered on your homeowner's policy is flood. So
now let me, and I apologize. I'm going to kind of interrupt every now and then just to make sure. Now, here we are, we're talking about rain and how that created a flood. Now, in this same situation, let's say the rain was just as impactful as it was, last week. And I didn't necessarily have my basement flood, but the wind and the amount of rain took some shingles off my roof, and I have a roof leak now. Is that something that would be covered under general insurance policies, or would that not be because, again, it's still considered flood, if you will? How does that work?
Great question. And to differentiate where that water damage comes from is key. So that scenario, shingles, wind damage causes shingles to displace and water gets in, that's covered. That is 100% covered on a homeowner's policy. And so the key is with water damage is when and how the water got into your home to cause damage. One rule of thumb I normally use that makes it pretty simple is once water hits the ground, if it caused damage after it hits the ground, it's not going to be covered for the most part.
Actually, that's good to know.
Flooding.
Yeah, I never even thought about it that way. That's a very good way, if you will, to look at it.
It makes it easy to understand.
So for example, if we have a ton of rain, nothing really happens in my house during the rain, and next thing I know, 3 hours after the rain, I'm starting to see water in my basement, which is basically, kind of what happened over the last few days. So that is something where if I didn't have flood insurance, I would not be covered. Is that
another beautifully led question? Because just to reiterate on that, once water hits the ground and now it's flooding water and it floods into your house from the ground, that's flood. Now, kind of where you led me with that was a few hours after a storm or during a storm, and there's water maybe backing up into your house, backing up through a water well or a sump pump. That is something that you can have coverage for on a homeowner's policy.
Oh, interesting.
It's its own separate endorsement to a homeowner, so it's not automatically included. Like rainwater coming in through a damaged roof would be always covered.
Sure.
But that water backup, it's a separate coverage. It's called water backup coverage by most companies. Some companies word it a little differently. Sewer backup, water backup, sump pump failure. So that type of water damage that were to back up in your basement would be something you can add coverage for a certain dollar amount. The minimum is $5,000, but a lot of companies allow you well above that as well.
Okay. Now you use the word endorsement.
Yes.
Now, for someone who doesn't understand insurance, and excuse my ignorance, would that be almost considered as just like an add-on? Like rather than using the word endorsement, it's here's your general policy. It doesn't cover these 7 or 8 items, but if you want, you can almost a la carte. You can
correct
on this endorsement plus this endorsement, which is that basically a good way to look at what an endorsement would be?
Yes, a la carte. Extra coverages that you can add on there, additional options to just spruce up your coverage a little bit. Correct.
What are so obviously what we're talking about here, the flood insurance. Now, is that considered an endorsement? Is that its own separate policy in itself?
It's going to be its own separate policy, and again, the flood program is run by the government.
Okay.
So they use your regular insurance companies to distribute the policies, but it's a universal policy that's run by the government, set the flood zones, and they provide the coverage through
do they also set premiums? Are they the ones who set premiums?
They're the same across, there's no different companies have different premiums. Flood premiums for the most part are going to be the same across whoever's providing it because it's coming from that one source.
Awesome. Okay. No, that makes perfect sense. Now, there's horror stories out there. In your experience, is flood insurance something, and again, not to actually give dollar amounts because I know that changes.
Sure.
There's a lot of moving mechanics to that. But if a consumer were to ask you, is flood insurance expensive? Is it, how would you prepare someone to kind of prepare them to digest the expense of flood insurance?
Sure. So when you're considering getting flood insurance, either you're going to be required to have it because you're in a flood zone. So you're either in a flood zone or you're not. If you're in a flood zone, you have to have it. So you don't really have a choice. And those policies can be fairly expensive, into the couple $1,000s a year.
Okay.
If you're not in a flood zone, it's a very affordable policy, a couple $100s a year.
Okay. So to kind of just snapshot, let's say I have I'm just going to throw some things out, 10-year-old, 2-story property, and, it's in a flood zone and it's going to be X.
Right.
If I take that same exact property and move it to an area where it's not in a flood zone, it's literally going to be a fraction of the cost simply because it's not in and if I'm not mistaken, it's FEMA who does the flood maps and determines what is versus what is not in the flood zone. Is that correct?
Correct. And they're changing them fairly consistently as well.
Yes. And I remember, if I'm not mistaken, I think they were reevaluated within the last couple of years. Is that?
Yes, I believe they fairly recently, but I think they're always kind of adjusting them, especially with the changing climate that we're having now, especially in our area in the Northeast in the past 5 to even look back 10 years. There's some major storms that we're not used to in this area. So these flood zones can definitely be changing. And that brings me to another point of, yes, if you're in a flood zone, you need flood insurance. And historically, if you're not in a flood zone, it's never been a strong recommendation to get it. They're fairly inexpensive, but it's probably a pointless policy because if you're not in a flood zone, you're probably never going to have an issue with a flood. Right. But with the changes we're seeing, it's very unpredictable weather. On I'm starting to think more about at least providing it as an option more consistently, even though in even very recent history, it probably is a pointless policy, but with this changing weather, it's very unpredictable.
Right, right.
It may be worth it more often than not.
I mean, I've been in real estate now for, I don't know, 15, 16 years. And I think in my history, with the exception of this last occurrence that we just had, I don't think, I think it was probably maybe 6 or 7 years ago where I saw it. I think it was Upper Darby that was affected. And I believe those houses actually were in a flood zone, but I would agree, you know, it's one of those things where it's few and far between, but it's a situation where, again, like if someone like you isn't, you know, proactive and at least educate their clients on it, it could be a situation where you're caught, for lack of a better term, with your pants down and not being able to make out. So all good stuff. Now, Chris, aside from that, what are some of the things that you've noticed in your experience when you are helping people identify policies and maybe dealing with claims and stuff like that? What are some of the other common misconceptions that people think they're protected when they have homeowners insurance, but it's that they may not necessarily be protected of, and you think they should be aware of? Does that make sense?
Sure. Water is a big one, especially on now homeowners policies are, especially in the real estate and mortgage industry, they're becoming forced upon you to get certain types of coverages. I'm sure you see the HO3 number thrown around in the real estate world. Like you don't have as many options to kind of go with lower coverage home policies because you're kind of, when you have a mortgage, they can kind of dictate what kind of policy you need.
If not, they're not going to give you the money.
Exactly. And that's their right to do. They're giving you hundreds of $1,000s. So it makes sense. And they want that asset that they're helping you obtain to be protected.
Right.
So they want that top of the line HO3 policy is what we call it. There is some policies above that, but that's your standard comprehensive homeowners policy that most people carry. In the past, there were some other homeowners policies that the main difference when you would downgrade the policy would be how water coverage would be applied. And that's where water comes into play. Some people would expect, like, let's say a rental policy. You have a rental home, you're a landlord. Some of the water coverages that you're going to get on those types of policies can be severely limited by some companies. Not all companies do it, but it's this sneaky language that gets thrown into some of those policies where you're not going to have that water coverage that you would expect on a policy like that. The other, and then the big one, staying on water, since that's our topic here, that water backup coverage endorsement that we had talked about. Again, it's optional. A lot of people don't get it, and I don't know how many agents out there are recommending it, because when you're sending out a quote, you're trying to give the best price you can, and adding those coverages aren't always going to keep you, when you're selling on price. But when you're selling coverage, it's a very important coverage to have, and I try to educate all my clients on at least telling them what it is. It is optional, but it's important to have.
Sure. No, that makes perfect sense. And I guess, Chris, kind of like some of the last questions I would have is, if I were to come to you as a first-time home buyer, and here I am, I'm excited about getting my insurance policy together. What would be your words of wisdom that would? Oh, of course, my phone's ringing now. What would be your words of wisdom to help me get the policy that I would deserve, if you will, or what would be your words of wisdom for somebody coming in completely naive to this?
Sure. So big things coverage wise, aside from getting that replacement cost policy and going through the time to make sure your home is covered properly and protected to replace it in the event of a loss. Also on homeowners, the next most important thing there is liability protection. Every homeowner is going to come with $100,000 liability, almost across all companies. An extra $20 a year triples that to $300,000. So that's don't fall for the low liability. Pay that extra $20 a year. Bump up liability protection.
just to stop you there, liability insurance. What's the difference between, and again, for someone who's completely ignorant to this, what exactly is liability? Is that if I have a party and someone trips and breaks their leg, or explain what exactly is liability?
To make it very simple, if anyone were to get injured on your property and sue you, you have liability protection. Whether you're negligent or not, your liability protection is gonna kick in and protect you in that lawsuit.
Okay. And what did you say you would suggest as a minimum for liability insurance?
$300,000.
Kind of a big blanket, but what would you say?
$300,000 is the minimum that I'll ever put on a homeowner's policy. You can go lower than that to get it bare bones, but $300,000, and the next step above that would be getting an umbrella policy. And an umbrella is going to give you excess liability on your homeowners as well as your auto. So that would tie in your auto for excess liability. And again, that's going to give you $1 million of coverage there for your liability, for depending on how many autos you have and your driver situation, whether you have kids driving or how many drivers. You're looking at between $200 to $500 a year for an extra $1 million of liability. That, your bang for your buck there is tremendous.
Yeah, and that's a whole, another conversation at one, maybe we can also do something different and kind of unpack that. But I don't think that a lot of people realize that some of the things that happen outside of your home, you mentioned kids and driving and all that, where if that insurance isn't properly in place, that people have the ability to come back and attach liens and other judgments against your personal property. And I guess that's kind of why you're stating this umbrella policy, to make sure that if other insurance isn't in place, at least the roof over your head is properly insured. Is that a fair statement?
Especially as the first-time home buyer, you're about to fork up a lot more money than you've ever done in your life as a first-time home buyer. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Price and cost is it's a stressful thing, and it's a big deal at that time. And what I try and instill in people is just don't overlook and say, I'll worry about coverage later. Make that a key aspect of, you're buying this home, you're putting all this money out. It's stressful and it's a lot. But you also want to protect what you're about to acquire. So
it's your money. That's your money and your future investment. And it's
the way to protect it is with liability. So
I had a huge smile as you were saying those things, because it came back to this cheesy saying that you hear people saying, where it's safety never takes a day off, and they're actually, not to say names, but there was a very large insurance company who had a very nice commercial campaign, if you will, where they actually were showing exactly that safety does not take a day off. And you know what? First, in my opinion, you don't cheap on insurance. That's one thing you never go cheap on.
Right.
And it seems like disaster strikes when people either don't have it or have decided to reduce it or something to that extent, because in their mind, they haven't used it for 4 or 5 years, maybe 10 or 20 years. And as soon as that mindset changes and they change their policy, boom.
Exactly. And you may never use your policy. You may never use a homeowner's or this umbrella excess liability policy. Hopefully
you don't.
You don't ever have to use it, because if you have to use that, something catastrophic happened in your life.
Yeah.
But that's the key. When and if that does happen, you're going to be thrilled to have that extra protection backing you.
Absolutely.
That's the key. It's peace of mind. It gives you peace of mind that if something crazy happens, you're going to have some protection, someone backing you.
Absolutely. And again, peace of mind, man, you hit the head right on the nail right on the head with that. It's peace of mind. And a lot of people don't sleep easy at night anymore simply because they skimped on things like this. And now they're either losing their home or they have judgments against them for whatever whatever the situation may be. So, Chris, I just want to thank you for taking the time to kind of unpack some of this for us. I think this has been very informative.
My pleasure. I appreciate it.
Do me a favor. If people want to reach out to you, which hopefully they should, if they have any questions regarding insurance, or maybe they're looking for a policy, how do people get a hold of you?
So I have a website, CNS, C Charlie N Nancy S Sam, the number 4 insurance.com. A lot of great information on that website, as well as, sure, we're going to throw this out on the social sites. I have a Facebook page as well that I will definitely respond to. And really, my website would give you all my other contact info: email, phone number, cell number.
So here's what I'll do: is when I post this, I obviously will tag you in it, and we'll just put in right in the comment section. We'll put in your website right there, so people have an easy reference to get a hold of you. So again, I want to thank you for taking the time to help me educate some people. And with that said, my friend, I really I wish you a great weekend. It's to my knowledge you're doing some traveling this weekend.
Little road trip up to Maine with my wife and 6.5-month-old daughter. So wish us luck.
Well, listen, man, I do wish you luck. I hope you guys have a great time. I'm pretty sure up in Maine, it's pretty hard not to have a great time. So with that being said, and while you're up there, they have phenomenal beer. As you know, I'm a big beer guy. Check out some of the breweries up there. And
got the breweries
some of that amazing lobster that you just don't get down here. But again, Chris, enjoy your weekend and safe travels, buddy.
Appreciate the time. Thanks, buddy.
Anytime. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.